Hello class, and welcome to our first lecture video here on Unit 6, which is going to cover the growth and division of cells, as well as throw in a little bit of information on DNA structure as well as DNA replication. So let's get going here. So our objectives for this unit overall is going to be the following here as soon as the curtains go by. Is we want to be able to describe how cell division occurs and all the key steps that are involved with it. In this particular lecture video, we're going to go over the differences between sexual and asexual reproduction. We will also describe the steps of what's referred to as binary fission in this lecture video. And eventually, as I mentioned, we'll come to understand both the structure of DNA as well as how it's going to be able to replicate itself, which is one of the more technical aspects of this unit. So let's begin here. In essence, reproduction is obviously a key characteristic of life. That was one of the key characteristics of life we began in the very first week of school. And in regards to cell division, again, this is going to be reproduction at the cellular level. All right, so within each and every individual cell that's capable of division. It will require the duplication of all DNA and chromosomes. And you will see how those duplicated chromosomes get sorted out and eventually separated into brand new identical cells that we refer to as daughter cells. So overall, what is cell division used for? All right, first off, it is used for reproduction. All right, more so focused right now for single-celled organisms such as over here bacteria, E. coli, you name it. Any type of bacteria that's a benefit to you right now on your skin, in your intestines for digestion, or ones that could make you sick like E. coli. All right, so they will just, reproduction refers pretty much just to the straight up cloning of a bacterial cell. Overall growth, in particular to multicellular organisms like you and I. So if you want to grow and get bigger, it's not your cells getting larger, it's just adding more and more cells, layer after layer after layer, to get bigger over time. So you have to add more cells in order to be able to do that. Repair and replacement of cells. So if you have any type of injury, for example, get a little cut on your finger here, all right, you need to repair those cells. So if you get a cut, you get a scab. That scab protects you from getting an infection. Meanwhile, the area that has been cut underneath the scab, the cells grow inwards to seal that gap, and then they'll grow upwards to eventually push off that scab. If you pick your scab off before the cells underneath have fully formed, and if you're a scab picker, you're going to create a scar because you expose actively growing cells that can then get injured by that act of removing the scab. Your normal layer of skin that you can feel right now in your hand, that's actually all dead. The ones underneath and actively growing are about 1 millimeter or so underneath your skin layer. And finally, especially for multicellular organisms that are going to perform sexual reproduction, you need to make both sperm and egg cells. Again, which is the way that over 99% of all life on Earth does it, is by producing sperm and egg, and each parent contributes half the genetic information to their offspring. All right, so again, sperm and egg are generally the ways that is done. Some other multicellular organisms won't do it quite the same way, like some plant species don't make with the characteristic sperm or egg, but they do a form of sexual reproduction. All right, so for asexual reproduction, all right, this again refers to pretty much the offspring are going to be 100% identical to the original cell. And then all genes or DNA is coming from that exact same parent. So there's two classes in which asexual reproduction can go, or two categories that we can look at. And some of those examples you can see down here. All right, one of them is called budding. This is actually a yeast cell that's eukaryotic, just like you and I. They have a nucleus and organelles, but they don't undergo sexual reproduction. They just start to grow a little appendage, looks like a growth that's coming off of them. And eventually, you can see how it's smaller too, right? It's not the same size as the original yeast. Eventually, that'll break off and bud off, and that'll be an identical clone of that original yeast cell. Same thing here in a hydra that you can find in the oceans. It actually is an animal, all right, but it does not go through sexual reproduction. It just has these little appendages that bud off and eventually break off and could become a brand new hydra animal as well. spider plants over here. All right, they don't do budding, but they do cloning. All right, and that's going to be called vegetative propagation on the next slide, where you might have this hanging in your house right now if one of your parents like plants. Spider plant is very easy to take care of, and they call it a spider plant because these little shoots come off that look like spider legs with little kind of like feet at the end. But these are called plantlets. These are identical clones of this original spider plant that if they break off, they can root themselves in the soil and grow a brand new plant. If you have one of these at home, when your parents aren't looking, go take a little pair of scissors, cut the little stem appendage off here, put the roots, or the part that you could see that would become the roots, into a glass of water, and you'll start to see a root system start to develop, and then you can go plant that into another little pot. So here's some of those forms of asexual reproduction I just mentioned. The first is budding. So again, budding is when you have a little appendage start to come off the organism that once it breaks off, it becomes an identical clone of the original. So this would be multicellular organisms, not just one cell budding off most times, but it could happen. Vegetative propagations, like I mentioned with the spider plant on the last page, or sometimes you can just cut a piece of the actual stem off and plant it. You could break off a part of the root system and plant it, and that'll give rise to a new plant that's identical to the original. Or this is called a snake plant, one of the next most common plants you can find in your house. It's pretty much impossible to kill. If you water it once a month, it's good to go as long as it's getting some light. Their blades look like little swords that are coming out of the pot like snakes, I assume is why they call it that. If you cut a little piece of this leaf, generally on an angle, and plant it in dirt, it'll start to root, and you'll get a new plant, just like the main one here that you took the plant snippings from. It's kind of cool. But again, this would all be forms of asexual reproduction. And the third and final type would be what we call binary fission, which is just simply dividing in half. So instead of a budding off of a smaller appendage, you're going to get an organism that splits right down the middle into two identical versions of itself. And this is going to be performed mainly just by bacteria, all types of bacteria. The current ones that we call bacteria or eubacteria, and the more ancient forms that are called archaea. So there's 3 stages to this. I'll just bring it all up. The bacterial cell will simply duplicate all of its DNA or chromosomes, and then starts to elongate, moves the DNA copies to each side of the elongated cell, and then just simply divides down the middle into 2 equal halves or daughter cells. So here's how that would look. All right, so here is a bacterial cell. It'll copy all of its DNA. You can see that the volume of it has now doubled. You can see that it's already elongating, spreading out compared to the last one. And then it'll eventually split right down the middle into 2 identical clones or daughter cells. Here's what it'll look like under an electron microscope of a bacterial cell. You can see the DNA has been duplicated, and here is the division into 2 evenly sized identical daughter cells at some point. Again, a version of cloning here. Now, there is definitely a negative aspect to sexual reproduction. And the fact of the matter is, if all individuals in a population are clones, anything that's a threat to them could wipe them all out. A new virus like COVID-19 that we're experiencing right now. A new predator that's introduced into the environment that none of the individuals can evade and survive. That could wipe out the entire population, causing an extinction level event. That's not good. Bacteria can get away with this because there's so many of them, millions and millions of them. If you have 1 billion bacterial cells and wipe out 990 million of them, you still have, what, 10 million left that can give rise to future generations. But larger multicellular organisms, plants, animals, that don't reproduce quickly, that's not going to happen. Plants can both do asexual or sexual reproduction, so it doesn't really affect them. But if you were to take, for example, from Star Wars, Jango Fett, all right, who is Boba Fett's father, and Boba Fett is a clone of his father, and if you watch The Mandalorian, Boba Fett's the green guy just popped up at the end of the 2nd season. All the original guys in white, the stormtroopers from the original Star Wars films, episodes 4, 5, and 6, which are the best, the originals, they're all identical versions of Jango Fett. So if their survival was based off shooting straight, if you've ever seen a Star Wars show, you know these guys can't shoot anything properly. One person could wipe out like 100 of these dudes. They would all go extinct if their life depended on shooting straight all the time. So having an entire clone population that are all identical is not advantageous, which is why over 99% of all life forms on Earth prefer to do sexual reproduction, where that each offspring is similar to the parents but not identical, right? Because they have some variations in the traits that were passed on to them, and variety is good. Right? Variety ensures your survival ultimately as a species, not necessarily an individual, but as a species overall. Because if you are not good at playing basketball, right? Maybe you get cut from the team, which is kind of depressing. But then you have a brother who's awesome at basketball, and he gets picked for the team, which is also kind of depressing. But if playing basketball was dependent upon our survival, at least one of you survives, right? To reproduce and continue the population over time. So variation, again, is good. And you are getting an inheritance of unique sets of genes from both parents. So your parents give you both the information for eye color, right? One parent gives you the information for brown eyes, one parent gives you the information for blue eyes. What do you end up with? Probably like light brown or hazel eyes. So some variation of those two traits. So to finish out here for our comparison between asexual and sexual, let's look at all the things for sexual reproduction here. All right, so for asexual, you're going to get identical offspring, genetically speaking. It only requires one parent. Advantage is it is fast and efficient because you can produce large numbers of individuals. However, if one dies, well, whatever caused that death, all individuals will be at the same threat. Then for sexual, we're going to get a more diverse or genetically diverse offspring possibilities. You need two parents this time around. Again, some plants can do asexual or sexual, but they would prefer to do this. It is, though, much slower than asexual reproduction. But ultimately, the slower reproduction pathway, think about humans, over 9 months to give birth to one child, but you get diversity in your offspring, which will hopefully lead to the survival of not only that individual, your species over time, but lead to small changes and evolution in general. And again, this is then as a result of that, even though it's slower, this is a big advantage for survival and change over time, in which why it's become, again, at least for most multicellular organisms, the most common form of life on Earth.